One of the camera techniques that portrait photographers like myself and others are very fond of is capturing an image with a shallow depth of field. And the reason is because it draws the viewer into the subject. Like with these two images, you can see their eyes are in focus. In the background, it's a blur. And the background's a blur because of that shallow depth of field. Yet still what can happen is you can have something in the background that is distracting, that you need to reduce or minimize. Like with these two images, you can see this one, there's this black line kind of coming out of his head, and the other one, we have these branches. So let's look at two different techniques for dealing with an issue in a background so that we can reduce or minimize that issue. We'll start off with this photograph here. This is a portrait of a friend who's a surfboard shaper. And I captured this image in his workshop, and there were two surfboards standing side by side, and the gap between the surfboards is this line. It really doesn't make sense or look very good. So in order to clean that area up, and also the shadow over here on the far left, we're going to create a new layer. So let's click on the new layer icon. We'll name this new layer Cleanup. And next we'll select one of our retouching tools. A really powerful tool to use is the clone stamp tool. You can find this one right here. You can select it by clicking on it or press the S key to choose it. Next, in the options bar, we want to define our brush size and also the hardness, so we'll take the hardness down. Next, we have an opacity setting. We'll talk about that in a second. You want to make sure you have align turned on and then sample layers. So again, the first step is to create a new layer. Second step, select the tool and go up to the options bar to dial in your options. Most importantly, you want to have align in all layers turned on. Now, the first thing I want to do is just kind of illustrate how this tool works. This will be a little bit silly, but it will make the point. What you do with this tool is you position your cursor over an area that you want to clone. Let's say the eye. Perhaps I want to replicate that. Hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on Windows, and click on that, and then reposition your cursor to another area and paint. And you can see how I'm bringing or cloning that content over. Now, with Align, regardless of where I click, I'm only going to have one eye. If we turn Align off, I can then go ahead and paint and move and paint and move and paint and move. And you can see how it's always going back to that original source area. So in my case, rather than doing that, what I want to do is I want to make sure Aligned is turned on so it's always consistent with the original source area. The next thing I want to highlight is opacity. We saw with 100% opacity, 100% of the image comes over. Well, if we take this down to, let's say, 40% opacity and do the same exact thing as before, Option or Alt click on the eye and then bring it over, you can see how it's just a very faint version of that. If we keep clicking, well, it builds it all the way up to 100%. All right, well, now that we've seen how this works, let me just delete what was there, and let's use this technique to improve the image. Now, with this line above, what I'm going to do is use the clone stamp tool. I want to make my brush a little bit bigger. It doesn't need to be huge, so go ahead and do that. Hardness 0. Opacity, I'll bring this up a little bit above 50%. Align turned on, sample always. Then we will Option or Alt click to set our source area to start to paint this over. You can also Option or Alt click from another area so that we can kind of hide or disguise what we're doing. You want to do that to make sure that you aren't creating what's called a repeating pattern. By Option or Alt clicking from different areas, you are creating a new pattern. And that's what I'm doing as I go through the image, Option or Alt click, and then sample a new area, and you can see how we've pretty easily removed that problem. What about this little line over here? With this one, I will Option or Alt click and set my source area, and then just paint over that, and Option or Alt click again. You get the idea as far as the rhythm of how this goes. Now, what happens if we're working on an area of the image, let's say down here by the shoulder? I'll make my brush big just to exaggerate for a moment. And we Option or Alt click, and we start to paint in the background, but as we do that, we realize, oh, we made a crazy mistake. What do we do? Well, because all of this retouching is on a separate layer, what we can do is simply choose the eraser tool, tap the E key, or just click on that tool. Up here, we have options for brush size and hardness and opacity. We want 100% opacity, right? And we can just erase what's on this layer. And this is one of the reasons why it's really nice to do all of this work on a separate layer. So we have our before, you can see here, and then now the after, which we accomplished by using the clone stamp tool. Now, to finish this image off, I'm realizing now that that black line's gone, there's too much headroom above. So here I'll select the crop tool, and I'm just going to click and drag this down. The reason why I want to do that is because now I'm really drawn into the subject versus seeing all that space above the subject. still holds up, still works, and still